The champagne glass slipped from Richard Wellington's hand and shattered on the polished deck as the massive Nigerian Navy destroyer's horn blasted 3 times in perfect military salute. Every single person on the luxury yacht, Golden Dreams, stood frozen in complete shock as they watched the warship's crew line up at attention on deck, saluting the quiet Nigerian woman they had been mocking and insulting for the past 2 hours. Admiral Aduni Okafor had endured their racist jokes about African poverty, their dismissive comments about her traditional Yoruba head wrap, and their cruel laughter when they assumed she was the yacht's cleaning lady from Lagos. She had said nothing when they questioned how someone from Nigeria could afford to be on such an expensive yacht off the coast of South Africa, and she remained silent when they suggested she must be some rich manservant who got lost. But now, as the destroyer NS Thunder positioned itself alongside their yacht, with hundreds of Nigerian sailors standing in perfect formation, the wealthy international guests realized they had made the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. What they didn't know was that Aduni was not just any Nigerian Navy officer. She was the first female admiral in the Nigerian Navy's history, and the commanding officer of the West African Maritime Defense Force. And the warship saluting her was the flagship of Africa's most advanced naval fleet. The next few minutes would humble these arrogant people in ways they never imagined possible, and teach them a lesson about respect that would echo across 2 continents. Admiral Aduni Okafor had been looking forward to this exclusive charity yacht party in Cape Town Harbor for weeks, not because she enjoyed fancy social events, but because the fundraiser was supporting education for underprivileged African children across the continent. As the daughter of a fisherman from Lagos who had worked 3 jobs to send her to university, Aduni understood the power of education to transform lives and lift entire communities out of poverty. She had graduated top of her class from the Nigerian Defense Academy, earned advanced degrees from universities in London and Paris, and had spent 15 years proving that African women could lead with excellence in any field they chose. When she received the invitation to this exclusive event hosted by international donors and African business leaders, she decided to attend wearing traditional Nigerian attire to honor her heritage, including a beautiful blue and gold gel head wrap that her grandmother had taught her to tie. Her outfit was elegant and expensive, made from the finest African fabrics. But to untrained eyes it looked foreign and different from the Western evening gowns worn by other guests. The yacht belonged to British mining magnate Sir James Morrison, who had made billions extracting diamonds and gold from African soil while claiming to support African development through his charitable foundation. As Aduni boarded the magnificent vessel anchored in Cape Town's glamorous waterfront, she immediately noticed the looks of confusion and disdain from other guests who clearly wondered how a traditional African woman had gained access to their exclusive world. She smiled politely and made her way to the donation table, writing a check that represented several months of her military salary, while overhearing whispered conversations in multiple languages about whether this African woman belonged at such a prestigious international gathering. The trouble began when Richard Wellington, a loud American oil executive who had spent decades exploiting African resources while looking down on African people, approached Aduni near the buffet table with a smirk on his face and his usual group of racist friends trailing behind him. "Excuse me, girl," he said in the condescending tone he typically used with African workers at his drilling sites. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here. This party is for international donors, not for local African staff." His friends chuckled as Aduni calmly replied in perfect Oxford English, "I am here as an invited guest, sir, and I have already made a substantial donation to support African education." Richard's wife, Margaret, a woman who collected African art while despising African people, stepped forward with a cruel smile and said, "Oh, honey, I'm sure you're very grateful for whatever job brought you here, but this event is for people who can write real checks. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of those village fundraisers." The casual racism in her voice was matched by nods of agreement from nearby guests, including several South African businessmen who had grown wealthy during apartheid and still carried those attitudes. French businessman Henry Dubois, whose family had exploited West African colonies for generations, laughed loudly and said, "Look at this one with her tribal costume. Probably thinks those colorful rags make her look important." Aduni felt the familiar sting of colonial arrogance and racial prejudice that her ancestors had fought against for centuries. But her military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure and never let ignorance provoke her into losing her dignity. She simply nodded and said, "I understand you may not be familiar with traditional African formal wear, but I assure you I have every right to be here." This measured response only seemed to encourage more mockery, with Richard loudly announcing to nearby guests, "Everyone look, we have a local trying to crash our international party. Should we call security or just let her serve us drinks like she's probably used to doing?" As the evening progressed on the yacht sailing through the beautiful waters off Cape Town, the harassment intensified as more wealthy international guests joined in. What they saw as harmless entertainment at the expense of the African woman they assumed was some kind of imposter. Victoria Sterling, a British pharmaceutical heiress whose companies had tested dangerous drugs on African populations, approached Aduni with fake sweetness and said, "Darling, since you're here anyway, would you fetch me some of that lovely South African wine, and be careful not to spill it on my dress?" When Aduni politely declined and explained again that she was a guest, Victoria's mask slipped completely and she snapped, "Listen, girl, I don't know what charity case let you on this boat, but you clearly don't understand your place, so either start acting like the help or swim back to whatever township you came from." German industrialist Klaus Weber, whose factories had polluted rivers across 3 African countries, decided to pile on with his own brand of European arrogance, saying, "These Africans always think they deserve what we worked for, probably never contributed anything meaningful to civilization." His comment drew murmurs of agreement from guests who had built their wealth by extracting resources from Africa while contributing nothing to African development. Australian mining executive David Thompson laughed cruelly and added, "At least she's dressed like she knows she's different from us civilized people, probably worships trees and thinks magic will solve her problems." The group erupted in laughter that echoed across the water, while Aduni stood there with quiet dignity, her hands clasped behind her back in the military stance that any naval officer would have recognized immediately. She had reached her breaking point with their ignorance and colonial attitudes, but instead of responding to their insults, she did something that confused them all. She walked calmly to the yacht's communication room, made a brief call in Yoruba that none of them understood, and then returned to the deck with the same composed bearing, saying simply, "I think you will soon understand exactly who I am and what I represent." The first sign that something extraordinary was about to happen came 30 minutes later when the yacht's South African captain, a former naval officer named Captain Botha, who understood military protocol, rushed onto the deck with a look of absolute panic on his weathered face. He had just received a radio communication in English and Yoruba that made his hands shake with sudden fear, and he immediately began scanning the crowd of international guests with desperate eyes until he spotted Aduni standing quietly near the railing, watching Table Mountain in the distance with serene calmness. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that trembled with newfound respect and terror, "I have just received word that the Nigerian Navy destroyer NS Thunder is requesting permission to approach our vessel. They say they need to locate their commanding officer who is aboard this yacht." Aduni turned to face him with a slight smile and replied in the crisp tone of military authority, "That would be me, Captain Botha, and I believe my crew has something important to demonstrate to our international friends here." The captain's face went completely white as he suddenly realized that the woman these guests had been insulting and degrading was not only a high-ranking military officer, but the commanding officer of one of Africa's most powerful warships. Richard Wellington, still drunk on his own arrogance and American superiority, laughed loudly and said, "What kind of African fantasy is this supposed to be? Are we supposed to believe this tribal woman commands a real military ship?" But his laughter died completely when he looked out over the Atlantic and saw the massive gray silhouette of a modern destroyer cutting through the waves toward them, its imposing presence flying both the Nigerian flag and the West African Maritime Defense Force banner, making their luxury yacht look like a child's toy floating in a bathtub. Other guests began noticing the approaching warship with growing alarm, and nervous chatter filled the air in multiple languages as people began to realize that their evening of casual racism was about to have very serious consequences. The mood on the yacht changed from smug superiority to growing panic as the NN's thunder drew closer, its massive hull bristling with modern weapon systems and communication arrays that represented the new face of African military power. The destroyer was a symbol of everything these colonial-minded guests refused to acknowledge, that Africa was no longer the helpless continent they remembered from their history books, but a rising power with educated leaders, advanced technology, and the military strength to protect its interests. Margaret Wellington grabbed her husband's arm with visible anxiety and whispered frantically, "Richard, what if that African woman really is important? What if we've made a terrible mistake? And this gets back to our business partners." But Richard was too proud and too blinded by decades of racial prejudice to back down, even as warning bells started ringing in his alcohol-clouded mind, and he doubled down by announcing loudly, "I don't care if the entire African Navy shows up. That woman doesn't belong here with educated people like us, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what I think about uppity Africans." His declaration was met with nervous laughter from some guests, while others began to sense that something was catastrophically wrong about the whole situation. French businessman Henry Dubois started sweating profusely as he watched the destroyer's crew moving with military precision across its deck, suddenly remembering that France still had major business interests across West Africa that could be jeopardized by international incidents. Victoria Sterling tried to quietly distance herself from the group that had been harassing Aduni, suddenly remembering urgent phone calls she needed to make to her company's African operations, but it was far too late for any of them to escape the consequences of their colonial arrogance. Aduni stood perfectly still at the yacht's railing, her colorful gel headwrap catching the sea breeze as she watched her ship approach with the pride of someone who had dedicated her life to proving that African excellence could not be denied or diminished by ignorance and prejudice. When the NN's thunder came to a complete stop alongside the luxury yacht, the contrast between the two vessels was breathtaking and deeply symbolic of the changing balance of power in the modern world. The yacht represented old colonial wealth, built on African exploitation, while the destroyer embodied the new Africa, educated, powerful, technologically advanced, and commanded by leaders who would no longer tolerate disrespect from anyone. As the warship's crew assembled on deck in perfect formation, their crisp naval uniforms bearing the proud insignia of the Nigerian Navy and the West African Maritime Defense Force, a deathly silence fell over the yacht party that was so complete. You could hear the African flags snapping in the ocean breeze. The destroyer's executive officer, Commander Yemi Adebayo, stepped forward with a megaphone and announced in a voice that carried across the water with unmistakable authority, "Ladies and gentlemen aboard the luxury yacht Golden Dreams, the Nigerian Navy ship Thunder requests permission to render full military honors to Admiral Aduni Okafor, commanding officer of the West African Maritime Defense Force and the first female admiral in Nigerian naval history, who is currently aboard your vessel." The words hit the international guests like physical blows, and you could literally watch the color drain from faces as people began to comprehend the magnitude of their racist mistake. Richard Wellington's mouth fell open in complete shock as he stared at Aduni with dawning horror, while his wife Margaret began crying openly as she realized How badly they had humiliated themselves in front of someone who commanded more real power than they could ever dream of possessing. Victoria Sterling actually stumbled backward and grabbed the yacht's railing to keep from fainting. Her earlier arrogance, completely replaced by terror about what this would mean for her business empire that depended heavily on African partnerships. Klaus Weber looked like he was about to vomit as he contemplated how his racist comments would sound when the story inevitably reached his African business associates, which it certainly would given the international nature of the gathering, and the involvement of a Nigerian Navy destroyer. The formal salute that followed was one of the most powerful displays of African pride and military excellence ever witnessed by international observers, a moment that would be remembered as symbolic of Africa's emergence as a force that demanded respect on the world stage. Commander Adebayo raised his hand in a crisp salute while simultaneously giving the command for full honors in both English and Yoruba, and instantly every single sailor on the destroyer's deck snapped to attention. In perfect unison that would have impressed any military academy in the world, the ship's horn blasted 3 long, thunderous notes that echoed across Table Bay like a declaration of African strength and dignity, while hundreds of crew members maintained their salute with precision that spoke of excellent training and genuine pride in their commanding officer. Aduni stepped forward to the yacht's railing and returned the salute with the bearing of someone who had earned every bit of respect she commanded, her traditional Nigerian attire suddenly looking more regal and dignified than all the European designer gowns around her. The sight of hundreds of African naval officers honoring this woman who had been treated like a servant just minutes before created a moment of profound shame among the yacht's international guests that would haunt many of them for years to come. As the formal ceremony continued, Commander Adebayo's voice came across the water again, saying, "Admiral Okafor, the officers and crew of NN's Thunder are honored to serve under your distinguished command, and we want these international visitors to know that your leadership has made the West African Maritime Defense Force a respected power in global naval operations." The commander then added, in a voice that carried both pride and warning, "We also want everyone present to understand that Admiral Okafor holds advanced degrees from the Royal Naval College in London and the École Navale in Paris, has commanded successful operations across 3 oceans, and represents the excellence that defines the new Africa." This additional information only deepened the humiliation of those who had assumed Aduni was uneducated or inferior, and several guests began desperately trying to figure out how they could apologize and minimize the damage to their business. Relationships across Africa. The aftermath of the destroyer's salute created a scene of complete moral reckoning that would be discussed in international business and diplomatic circles for years as an example of how colonial attitudes and racial prejudice could be utterly destroyed by African excellence and dignity. Richard Wellington, the loudest and most offensive of Aduni's tormentors, approached her with tears streaming down his red face and attempted what he probably thought was an apology, saying in a voice that shook with fear, "Admiral, I had no idea of your position. If I had known your rank, I never would have spoken that way." Aduni looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who had spent her career dealing with such people and replied, "Mr. Wellington, that is precisely the problem. You treated me with disrespect because you assumed I was inferior due to my race and nationality, not because you didn't know my title. And that reveals everything about your character and the colonial mindset that still poisons international relations." Her words cut through him like a sword because they exposed the fundamental racism that had guided his behavior not just that evening, but throughout his decades of business dealings across Africa. Margaret Wellington tried desperately to excuse their actions by claiming they had been drinking and misunderstood the situation. But Aduni simply said, "Madam, alcohol does not create racism. It only reveals what was already in someone's heart, and tonight you have shown me exactly what you think of African people." Victoria Sterling found herself unable to speak as she approached Aduni, the full weight of her cruelty becoming clear in the face of obvious excellence and achievement that challenged everything she had believed about African capabilities. Henry Dubois, the French businessman, actually attempted to leave the party early rather than face the consequences of his colonial attitudes, but several other guests made sure he understood that his behavior had been witnessed by people with significant influence in African business circles. Meanwhile, other guests who had remained silent during the harassment began approaching Aduni to express their admiration for her achievements and their shame at not intervening, though Aduni noted that their newfound respect had only appeared after they learned of her power and position. 1 year later, the story of what happened on that yacht in Cape Town Harbor had become a powerful symbol across Africa of how excellence and dignity could triumph over racism and colonial attitudes, inspiring a new generation of young Africans to pursue careers in military service, international business, and diplomacy. Admiral Aduni Okafor had returned to her duties commanding the West African Maritime Defense Force, but she often reflected on that evening and what it revealed about both the persistence of colonial mindsets and the power of African achievement to challenge and change those attitudes. Richard Wellington's oil operations across West Africa faced significant difficulties as word of his behavior spread through business networks, with several African governments reviewing his contracts and local partners expressing concerns about working with someone who had shown such disrespect for African leadership. Margaret Wellington began supporting African educational charities in what appeared to be an attempt to repair her reputation, though Aduni suspected it was motivated more by business concerns than genuine remorse. Victoria Sterling's pharmaceutical empire faced serious challenges when African health ministers learned of her conduct, leading to the cancellation of several major contracts and a recognition that the days of treating African leaders with disrespect were permanently over. The yacht's captain, Bota, had requested permission to visit Nigeria to personally apologize to Admiral Okafor and learn more about the impressive naval capabilities he had witnessed that evening. Most importantly, the story inspired countless young African women who saw in Aduni an example of how education, dedication, and excellence could break down barriers and command respect anywhere in the world. Aduni began receiving letters from students across Africa who told her that her example had motivated them to pursue careers in military service, engineering, and international relations despite the obstacles they might face from those who still clung to outdated ideas about African capabilities. She established a scholarship program for underprivileged African students interested in naval careers, using her own resources and donations from people across the continent who had been inspired by her story. The NN's Thunder became known throughout international naval circles as one of the most disciplined and effective warships in operation, with officers from other navies requesting opportunities to train alongside a crew that had proven African military excellence could match any force in the world.